In thinking of America, I sometimes find myself admiring her bright blue sky, her grand old woods, her fertile fields, but my rapture is soon checked when I remember that all is cursed with the infernal spirit of slaveholding and wrong. I am filled with an unutterable loathing. Frederick Douglass. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A new course had been set on the North American continent. A new nation born with liberty on the mind, freedom on the tongue, but at its heart, slavery. The United States of America had successfully dissolved the political bands that connected it to the mother country, Great Britain. Yet, nothing had dissolved the physical chains that connected 1 out of 5 American residents to their so-called masters. Tens of thousands of African Americans found freedom at the end of the Revolutionary War, most escaping on departing British ships. For those left stranded, it would be back to business as usual, and the business of slavery was unusually bitter, harsh, and cruel. It would be a rough start for the new United States. The government under the Articles of Confederation proved to give too much freedom to state governments, making the national government weak and ineffective, unable to pay its bills or control an increasingly impatient population. A rebellion led by Farmer Daniel Shays, backed by countless other veterans of the Revolution, had grown tired of waiting for the United States government to pay up, and they made it clear that this experiment in democracy needed fixing, and fast. A constitutional convention was held, and although a distrustful Patrick Henry declared, "I smell a rat," and refused to attend the 1787 Philadelphia meeting, the show went on. 55 delegates did meet, and the foundation was laid to give the national United States government more power over state governments. Believing that slavery was on its deathbed, the members of the convention did not mention the word slave one time. But as essayist John Chapman wrote, "There was never a moment during this time when the slavery issue was not a sleeping serpent. That issue lay coiled up under the table during the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention." As these founding fathers peered into their future, they saw tobacco plantations drying up and the institution of slavery along with them. But their vision was blurred. By 1800, the cotton gin came into full focus. In 1793, 5 years after the Constitutional Convention, Eli Whitney invented a cotton engine, or cotton gin. The machine removed seed from cotton, a job that once took one enslaved person 10 hours to remove seeds from a single pound of cotton now took minutes. One machine could do the work of 50, perhaps 100 enslaved workers. I know what you're thinking. Slavery really is going to die. With this machine, less enslaved people will be needed. Good thinking, but wrong. With the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, the United States doubled in size. Millions of acres of land became available, more cotton could be planted and picked. Heading into the 19th century, The amount of enslaved people more than doubled. Eli Whitney's cotton gin breathed new life into the once dying institution of slavery. At the early age of 10 years old, George Washington could already call 10 enslaved people his personal property. Later in life, Washington spoke of his wish to not see slavery last. "I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." Washington's actions seem to cast some doubt on the degree of that sincerity. In his life, George Washington inherited enslaved workers, purchased others, and received 80 or so enslaved people through his marriage with Martha Custis. His Mount Vernon plantation became home at times to over 150 captive people. In a letter to John Francis Mercer, Washington says, "I will take 6 more Negroes. The Negroes I want are males, 3 or 4 young fellows for ditch digging, and the like number of well-grown lads for artisans." Washington goes on to say, "Your word that the whole are healthy, and none of them addicted to running away. Running away I hate, and unhealthy Negroes, women, children, would not suit my purposes on any terms." But Washington would promise that he would never add another enslaved worker by way of purchase. But when his highly respected, highly valued cook, Hercules, decided to make a break for freedom, Washington was ready to head back to the market. In a letter to his nephew, George Lewis, Washington says, "Dear Sir, the running off of my cook has been a most inconvenient thing to this family, and what renders it more disagreeable is that I had decided never to become the master of another slave by purchase, but this decision I fear I must break." In the early days of his presidency, George Washington hadn't gotten around to placing the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. The president's temporary home was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was one of a few northern states beginning to phase out slavery through gradual emancipation. Pennsylvania law stated that enslaved people who moved into the state would be free after 6 months. But Washington, who always traveled with enslaved people from his Virginia home, found a way around this Pennsylvania law. Every 6 months, he would simply send his enslaved workers out of Pennsylvania with Mrs. Washington, and then promptly bring them back into Pennsylvania. This would reset the 6-month clock, allowing the Washingtons to keep a tight hold on the people they believed were legally theirs. Pretty slick, huh? So what's the full story behind that cherry tree cutting incident anyway? One enslaved woman named Oni Judge, Martha's personal servant, took advantage of all this moving around. She ran away, and although she was relentlessly pursued by George Washington until his dying days, she was never caught, living out her life as a free woman. Upon Washington's death, he stipulated in his will that the enslaved lives he owned would be free, but only after the death of his wife, Martha Custis. News of the impending freedom spread throughout the plantation like wildfire. Washington had put a price on his own wife's head, a price quite a few were willing to pay. After a series of mysterious fires around Mount Vernon plantation, Martha decided not to wait. She granted immediate freedom to her husband's enslaved workers, possibly prolonging her own life. Of the 317 people working at Mount Vernon in 1799, only 123 were George Washington's property. The majority were the legal property of the Custis family and were never freed. Throughout George Washington's adult life, he seemed to struggle with the issue of slavery, but taking a strong stand for the abolition of this terribly wretched system never happened. During the Revolutionary War, Washington long feared handing out guns to African Americans to serve in his Continental Army. The fear of revenge weighed heavily on the first president's mind. The end of slavery could be dangerous.